I will not be your bride." The words left my mouth before I could stop them, echoing through the cavernous throne room like a bell tolling my own doom. Every guard, every shadowed courtier, every ancient stone in Blackfang Castle seemed to freeze at the sound of my defiance. King Alaric Blackfang sat motionless on his obsidian throne, a figure carved from winter itself, pale skin that had never seen sunlight, dark hair falling past broad shoulders, and eyes the color of smoke and old blood. He was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, sharp, cold, and designed to cut. But he didn't rage, didn't rise, didn't even blink. Instead, he studied me with the kind of assessing calm that was somehow more terrifying than fury, as if my rebellion was a puzzle he'd already solved and found mildly disappointing. I was 22 years old, standing in chains before the most feared creature in the kingdom, and I had just declared war. Before we continue this story, please subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. 3 days earlier, I'd been working in my family's small apothecary shop in the village of Briarvale, grinding herbs for winter remedies and watching my 15-year-old sister Lyra practice her needlework by the window. She was humming some cheerful tune about spring flowers, completely unaware that the blood moon was rising that very night. The blood moon call came at sunset, a sound that wasn't quite a bell or a horn, but something that vibrated through bone and blood, calling every unmarried woman between 15 and 30 to the village square. It happened once a year, always on the winter solstice, and everyone knew what it meant. The vampire king required his bride. Every year, one woman was chosen. Every year, she was taken to Blackfang Castle. And every year, she vanished, never to be seen again. Some said the king consumed their life force to maintain his immortality. Others whispered he was building an army of shadow creatures. A few claimed the brides were transformed into something no longer human, kept in the castle's deepest dungeons. No one knew for certain. But everyone feared. I grabbed Lyra's hand as the call resonated through our shop. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't go to the square. Celine, I have to, the law says. I'll represent our family." I squeezed her hand tight. "Promise me you'll stay." She promised. I should have known better than to trust a 15-year-old's fear would outweigh her curiosity. When I reached the square, hundreds of women stood in terrified clusters, their breath fogging in the freezing air. The village elder held an ancient scroll, his hands shaking as he unrolled it. The blood moon hung overhead, massive and red as a wound. "The call has chosen," he announced, his voice cracking. "Lyra Briarvale." My heart stopped. No, not Lyra. Not my baby sister, who still braided flowers into her hair and believed in fairy tales. Not the girl who'd never hurt anyone, who spent her days tending our small garden and dreaming of traveling beyond our village walls. I pushed through the crowd, my voice raw. "There's been a mistake. She's only 15, she's too young." "The call does not make mistakes," the elder said, but I saw pity in his ancient eyes. "The blood moon has spoken." That's when I saw her, Lyra, standing at the edge of the square, her face pale but determined. She'd come anyway, despite her promise. And now the guards were moving toward her, reaching for her arms. "No." I threw myself between them and Lyra. If I went to Blackfang Castle, I could find a way to end this. To stop the annual cycle of terror. To vanquish the monster who'd been stealing girls for centuries. I would play the obedient bride. And then I would bring about King Alaric's downfall. The guard conferred with the elder in hushed whispers. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. Celine Briarvale, you are bound by the blood moon call." They clamped iron manacles around my wrists before I could change my mind. Lyra was screaming, reaching for me, held back by neighbors who wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother appeared at the crowd's edge, her face stricken with grief and pride in equal measure. "I'll come back," I called to them, not sure if it was a promise or a lie. "I'll find a way." The carriage that took me to Blackfang Castle was black as a hearse, drawn by horses whose eyes glowed faint red in the darkness. I sat alone in the velvet-lined interior, my mind cataloging every useful piece of information I'd ever learned about vampires. They were vulnerable to certain herbs. Nightshade extract could slow their healing, though it took massive doses. They required blood to survive, but also something else, something the old texts called life essence, that was never clearly defined. And they were bound by ancient laws and rituals that even they couldn't break. I had 3 vials hidden in the lining of my dress, 2 of concentrated nightshade extract, 1 of experimental preparation I'd created by combining hemlock, wolfsbane, and crushed silverleaf. Any one of them could incapacitate a human for days. Whether they'd work on an immortal king was another question entirely. But I had to try. For Lyra. For all the girls who'd vanished before me. The castle appeared at midnight, rising from the mountainside like a monument to darkness itself. Black stone, soaring towers, and windows that reflected the blood moon like 1,000 watching eyes. The gates opened without anyone touching them, and the carriage rolled through into a courtyard where torches burned with cold blue flame. Guards in black armor escorted me through corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, stone walls carved with symbols I couldn't read, archways that led to darkness, and everywhere a suffocating silence broken only by our footsteps. We stopped before massive doors carved with images of wolves and ravens. The guards pushed them open, revealing a throne room so vast the ceiling disappeared into shadow. And there, elevated on a dais of pure obsidian, sat King Alaric Blackfang. He didn't look like a monster. That was the first terrible thought that crossed my mind. He looked like a man, impossibly beautiful, yes, with features too perfect to be entirely human, but still fundamentally recognizable. Until you met his eyes and saw the centuries staring back. Celine Briarvale. His voice was deep and carried the weight of absolute authority. You took your sister's place. It wasn't a question. Somehow, he already knew. Yes. I lifted my chin, refusing to show fear even though my heart hammered against my ribs. I'm here willingly. I've fulfilled the call. Willingly. He repeated the word like he was tasting it. How interesting. Most brides arrive in tears, begging for mercy. He stood, descending the dais with movements too fluid to be entirely natural. But you don't strike me as someone who begs, do you, Celine? He stopped 3 paces away, close enough that I could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the faint scars on his hands that suggested even immortals could be wounded. And that's when I said it. When I looked into those ancient, assessing eyes and spoke the defiance I'd been holding like a weapon since the moment the guards took me. I will not be your bride. The throne room fell into absolute silence. King Alaric's expression didn't change. He simply studied me with that unnerving calm, his head tilting slightly as if I were a particularly interesting specimen he'd discovered. No, his mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Then what, precisely, do you intend to be, Celine Briarvale? Your executioner, I thought. Your downfall. The end of your reign of terror. But I couldn't say that. Not yet. Not until I understood what I was truly facing. So instead, I met his gaze and said quietly, alive. I intend to survive you. For the first time, something flickered in King Alaric's expression. Not anger, but something almost like recognition. Or perhaps respect. We shall see, he said softly. Then he turned to the guards. Summon the priestess. If Miss Briarvale insists on survival, let's bind her fate to mine properly. The ritual begins now. The ritual had left a mark on my wrist, a silvery tracework that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat, visible only when light hit it at certain angles. The priestess had called it the life force connection, binding my essence to King Alaric's until the next blood moon. I called it a leash. For 3 days, I'd been confined to chambers so luxurious they felt like a gilded cage, velvet curtains, a bed large enough for 4 people, and windows that overlooked a courtyard I wasn't permitted to enter. Guards stood outside my door at all times, silent and watchful, ensuring I had everything I needed except freedom. I spent those days searching my rooms for weaknesses, testing the windows for possible escape routes, and planning how to administer the neutralizing preparation I still had hidden in my dress lining. But every plan ran into the same problem. I knew nothing about my enemy except the legends, and legends were notoriously unreliable. On the fourth morning, I woke to screaming. Not human screaming, something deeper, more primal, like the earth itself crying out in agony. The sound rattled the windows and sent my water glass tumbling to the floor. I ran to the window and looked down into the courtyard. What I saw made no sense. The courtyard's stone floor had split open, revealing a chasm that descended into absolute darkness. The crack was spreading, spider webbing across the ground with audible snaps of breaking stone. And standing at the chasm's edge, alone and utterly still, was King Alaric. He wore no crown, no elaborate robes, just simple black clothing that made him look almost human. His hands were raised, palms facing the chasm, and I could see something emanating from him. Not light, exactly, but energy that distorted the air like heat waves, visible as ribbons of silver-blue power that poured from his body into the broken earth. I watched, transfixed, as the chasm began to close. Slowly, impossibly, the stone knitted itself back together under the force of whatever power he was channeling. The screaming sound faded to a low rumble, then to silence. The entire process took nearly an hour. By the end, King Alaric stood swaying slightly, his face pale even by vampire standards, one hand pressed against a nearby pillar for support. That's when I realized my door was open. The guards were gone, likely called away to deal with whatever catastrophe had caused the chasm. This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. I should have run. Should have searched for an escape route while the castle was in chaos. Instead, I found myself descending the stairs to the courtyard, drawn by a question I couldn't ignore. What was he? King Alaric sensed me before I spoke, his head turning slightly, though he didn't straighten from his exhausted lean against the pillar. You should be in your chambers. The door was open. I moved closer, studying the now-sealed courtyard floor. No trace remained of the chasm except for faint hairline cracks. What was that? What just happened? The kingdom is dying. His voice was flat, drained of the commanding authority I'd heard in the throne room. It has been dying for centuries. The magic that holds this realm together frays a little more each year. Chasms open. The shadow veil thins. Reality itself begins to tear. He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his face I hadn't expected. Bone-deep weariness. I spend my nights mending what I can. It's never enough. I stared at him, my prepared speeches about tyranny and cruelty dying on my tongue. You're fixing it? Yourself? Who else would? A bitter smile touched his lips. The people believe I'm a monster who devours brides for pleasure. Let them believe it. Fear keeps them away from the places where the veil is thinnest, where things that shouldn't exist try to break through. He pushed away from the pillar, standing with visible effort. I am not a destroyer, Celine. I am a sentinel of what remains. A guardian of a kingdom that would collapse into shadow and chaos without someone holding the pieces together. The sincerity in his voice shook something loose in my certainty. Then why the brides? Why take a woman every year if not for what? Power? Entertainment? His laugh was sharp and humorless. You truly don't understand what you've walked into, do you? He took a step toward me, and I saw the mark on his wrist identical to mine, pulsing in the same rhythm. The brides were never for me, Celine. They were protection. A barrier. And you, by choosing to take your sister's place, have broken a pattern that's held for 300 years. Cold dread settled in my stomach. What pattern? King Alaric's expression hardened. Come. If you insist on surviving me, you need to understand what's really at stake. And why your defiance may have just doomed us both. He turned and walked toward the castle's eastern wing, his exhaustion evident in every step. And despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed. The eastern wings smelled of old parchment and something else, a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood, though I saw none. King Alaric led me through corridors lined with portraits, dozens of them, each depicting a different woman. Young and old, beautiful and plain, smiling and solemn. All wearing the same silvery mark on their wrists that now adorned mine. The brides, I whispered, recognition hitting me like a physical blow. Yes. He stopped before a heavy door carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. But not what you think. Not what anyone thinks. His hand rested on the door handle, and I saw it tremble slightly, the only sign of whatever emotion he was suppressing. What I'm about to show you is a secret kept for 3 centuries. A lie I've let the kingdom believe, because the truth would cause panic I cannot contain. He pushed the door open, revealing a circular chamber dominated by a massive stone altar. But it wasn't the altar that made my breath catch, it was the walls. Every surface was covered in writing, thousands upon thousands of words carved in different hands, different languages, all spiraling toward the center where a single phrase was burned into the stone in letters that seemed to absorb light. We choose the darkness to hold back the greater night. Read them, King Alaric said quietly, stepping aside. Read their words. The women you think I murdered. The brides you believe I consumed. I moved closer, my eyes tracking the nearest inscriptions. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, and the words were dated. Meredith Ashton, year 247 of the Blood Rain. I go willingly to hold what must be held. My life given so thousands may live unknowing. Tell my mother I was brave. Eliana Frost, year 251. The Umbra rises. I feel it pulling at the edges of reality. If this ritual can contain it for another year, my death has meaning. I am not a victim. I am a guardian. Sarah Thornhart, year 283. They will call me the king's sacrifice. Let them. The truth would drive them mad. Better to be remembered as a cautionary tale than for the kingdom to know what waits in the shadow places, hungry and patient. My hands shook as I read entry after entry, each one a testament written by a woman who knew exactly what she was facing and chose it anyway. Not victims. Not sacrifices in the way I'd understood. Volunteers. What is the Umbra? I turned to face King Alaric, my voice hoarse. What are they talking about? His expression was carved from stone. An ancient curse bound to my bloodline 300 years ago by a sorcerer king I defeated in battle. He couldn't kill me, I was already immortal, so instead he cursed me with something worse. A shadow entity that feeds on life force, growing stronger each year until it becomes powerful enough to break free and consume everything in its path. He moved to the altar, his fingers tracing symbols I couldn't read. The only way to contain it is through a willing transfer. A life force freely given creates a barrier the Umbra cannot cross. The ritual must be performed annually, under the blood moon, using a woman's essence because the curse specifically demands balance, life force from those who create life. Horror crawled up my spine. You've been killing women every year to contain this thing? They chose. His voice was sharp as breaking glass. Every single one was told the truth. Everyone was given the option to refuse. And everyone understood that their willing sacrifice would hold the Umbra for another year, keeping it weak enough that I could fight it back before it gained full strength. He turned to face me, and I saw centuries of guilt etched into every line of his face. The brides did not die for me, Celine. They died protecting the kingdom from an ancient terror that your legends and fairy tales couldn't begin to comprehend. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. Then why didn't you tell people? Why let them think you were a monster? Because if they knew the truth, they would panic. They would try to fight the Umbra themselves and fail catastrophically. Or worse, they would refuse to send anyone, believing they could simply wait it out. His laugh was bitter. The Umbra doesn't wait. Without the annual containment, it grows exponentially. 3 years without the ritual, and it would be strong enough to tear through the veil completely. 5 years, and this kingdom would be nothing but shadow and ash. So you let them hate you. The words came out as barely a whisper. You let yourself become the villain so they'd never have to know what they were really afraid of. Yes. Simple. Absolute. And it worked. For 300 years, the cycle held. The brides came willingly, though the kingdom didn't know it, and the Umbra remained contained. His eyes found mine, and I saw something like fear behind the ancient calm. Until you. The mark on my wrist pulsed, suddenly hot. What do you mean, until me? King Alaric's expression hardened into something terrible. You weren't chosen by the call, Celine. Your sister was. And when you took her place, when you declared, I will not be your bride, with genuine defiance instead of the fearful acceptance the ritual requires, you broke the pattern. The Umbra sensed it. And for the first time in 3 centuries, it's waking early. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. From somewhere deep beneath the castle, I heard it, a sound like breathing, vast and patient and utterly inhuman. It's already here, I whispered. Yes. King Alaric's hand found the hilt of a sword I hadn't noticed hanging on the wall. And unless we find a way to complete the ritual properly, with your willing acceptance instead of defiant survival, it will break free within days. And when it does, Celine, your courage won't save your sister. Nothing will save anyone. The breathing sound grew louder, closer, as if something massive was ascending from the depths. And I finally understood the true horror of what I'd done. Will Celine choose to become the willing bride to save the kingdom, or will her defiance doom them all? Drop your predictions in the comments below. And if you're hooked on this dark tale of sacrifice and secrets, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens when the Umbra finally breaks free. The breathing grew louder, echoing up from somewhere beneath our feet like the rhythm of a sleeping giant stirring to wakefulness. King Alaric moved to the altar with practiced urgency, his hands tracing symbols that began to glow faint silver under his touch. Warding marks, he said without looking at me. They'll hold for a few hours. Maybe less. His jaw clenched. The Umbra is testing the boundaries already. It knows something changed. I stood frozen in the center of that circular chamber, surrounded by the testaments of 300 dead women, finally understanding the weight of what I'd interrupted. You said the ritual requires willing acceptance. But I came here willingly. I took Lyra's place by choice. You came here willing to survive me, he interrupted, his voice sharp. Willing to find a way to bring about my downfall. Willing to play a role long enough to strike. He turned to face me fully, and I saw something dangerous in his expression. The ritual the priestess performed, the life force connection that bound us, it requires more than physical presence, Celine. It requires surrender. Trust. A genuine willingness to merge your essence with mine without reservation or deception. The mark on my wrist burned. But I didn't know. Exactly. His hands stilled on the altar. Every bride before you understood what she was walking into. She was told the truth, given time to accept it, and then she made a conscious choice to offer herself as a containment mechanism. He moved toward me, each step deliberate. They were afraid, yes, grief-stricken at leaving their families. But they chose with open eyes and willing hearts. Their life force flowed freely into the ritual, creating a barrier pure enough to hold the Umbra for another year. And mine didn't. The realization settled like lead in my stomach. Your essence was tainted with defiance, with deception, with the active intention to harm me. He stopped an arm's length away. The ritual priestess didn't notice, because the binding itself completed, our marks formed, our life forces connected on a surface level. But the deeper transfer, the true surrender required for containment. He gestured to the floor, where I could now see hairline cracks forming in the ancient stone. It never happened. Which means the Umbra has no new barrier to fight through. The breathing sound intensified, and I swore I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. Why didn't you tell me this immediately? My voice came out sharper than intended, fear manifesting as anger. Why let me walk around for 3 days thinking? Because I hoped I was wrong. The admission seemed to cost him. I hoped that perhaps the ritual had adapted, that your strength of will might substitute for willing surrender. I spent 3 nights reinforcing every ward in this castle, trying to buy time. His hand moved to his sword hilt again. But the cracks are spreading faster than I can repair them. And this morning's chasm wasn't a natural decay of the kingdom's magic, Celine. It was the Umbra's first attempt to break through. Horror and guilt warred in my chest. The courtyard. That was my fault. Yes. No comfort in his voice, just brutal honesty. Your defiance created a weakness the curse immediately exploited. And it will keep exploiting it, growing stronger with each passing hour, until either we complete the ritual properly or it breaks free completely. From beneath us came a new sound, not breathing now, but something like words spoken in a language that predated human speech. The temperature dropped further, and I saw my breath fog in the air. What happens if it breaks free? I whispered. King Alaric's expression went carefully blank. The Umbra is a manifestation of pure entropy. It doesn't kill quickly or cleanly. It simply unmakes things. Turns matter back into shadow, thought into silence, life into the absolute absence of existence. His voice dropped. The previous brides understood this. They saw what the Umbra could do when I showed them the contained fragments in the deepest vault. They chose their deaths because the alternative was watching everyone they loved simply cease to be. He moved to one of the walls, pressing his hand against a section of carved text. A hidden door slid open, revealing a descending staircase that radiated cold so intense it hurt to breathe. Come, he said. If you truly want to understand what your defiance has unleashed, I'll show you. But I warn you, Celine, once you see the Umbra in its contained state, you cannot unsee it. And you will understand exactly why those women made the choice they did. I looked at the staircase, at the darkness below that seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to run, to find some other solution that didn't require descending into whatever nightmare waited in the depths. But I thought of Lyra, humming in our apothecary shop, braiding flowers into her hair. I thought of my mother's stricken face as the guards took me. I thought of all the people in the kingdom who had no idea what slept beneath their feet, held back only by the annual sacrifice of women whose names they'd never know. I thought of 300 brides who'd walked into darkness willingly so others could live in light. Show me, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Show me what I've done. King Alaric's expression flickered with something that might have been respect. Or perhaps just recognition of another person walking knowingly toward their own doom. Very well, he said quietly. But understand, Celine, what you're about to see cannot be fought with nightshade extract or clever tricks. The Umbra is not a monster to be vanquished. It's a fundamental force of dissolution that can only be contained. He began descending the stairs, his voice echoing in the narrow space. And if we cannot find a way to make you willing enough to complete the ritual before the next blood moon rises, that force will consume everything you've ever loved, starting with the sister you came here to save. The breathing from below grew louder, forming words in that ancient, terrible language. And despite every fiber of my being screaming in protest, I followed King Alaric down into the darkness to face the true monster I'd accidentally set free. The stairs descended for what felt like miles, each step taking us deeper into cold that burned my lungs and made my bones ache. The walls here were no longer carved stone, but something older, smooth black surface that absorbed light and seemed to pulse with its own terrible rhythm. King Alaric's torch did nothing to push back the darkness. It simply existed within it, a small circle of defiance that the shadows tolerated but did not retreat from. We're beneath the original castle, he said, his voice tight. This vault was built by the sorcerer king who cursed me, designed specifically to contain what he created. He stopped before a door that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. What lies beyond this threshold is the Umbra in its weakest, most contained state. Even seeing it carries risk. What kind of risk? The kind where looking too long can convince you that existence itself is meaningless. that giving in to the void would be mercy. His hand rested on the door, but he didn't open it yet. The brides who came before you, they looked. They understood. And then they chose to stand between this and everyone they loved. He pushed the door open. The chamber beyond defied rational description. It was vast, impossibly vast for something supposedly beneath a castle, and filled with a darkness that was more than absence of light. This darkness had texture, weight, intention. It moved like liquid smoke, pressing against invisible barriers that glowed faint silver where the darkness touched them. And at the center, suspended in chains of pure light that looked like they were woven from moonbeams and agony, was the Umbra itself. It had no fixed form. One moment it resembled a massive serpent, the next a wolf the size of a house, then something with too many limbs and eyes that wept shadows. But always, always, it radiated hunger, not for food or blood, but for cessation. For the ending of all things. When it sensed us, it turned. And I felt its attention like ice water in my veins. Broken pattern, it whispered directly into my mind, its voice the sound of stars dying. Defiant bride. Unwilling vessel. You have weakened the chains. You have given me purchase in the waking world. I stumbled backward, and King Alaric's hand caught my arm, steadying me. Don't listen, he commanded. It will try to convince you that surrender is inevitable, that fighting is pointless. But the Umbra's voice continued, seductive and terrible. 300 years I have waited, fed on scraps of willing sacrifice. But you, little defiant one, you offered me something new. Rage. Determination. The will to destroy rather than submit. Such delicious strength, wasted on resistance. The chains binding it flickered, and I saw one snap with a sound like breaking glass. It's getting stronger, I whispered. Yes. King Alaric pulled me back toward the door. Because every moment you remain unwilling, every second you cannot bring yourself to trust me enough for the true binding, it feeds on the discord between us. Your defiance is exactly what it needs to break free. We retreated to the staircase, and he sealed the door behind us with words of power that made my teeth ache. But I could still feel the Umbra's presence, vast and patient, waiting for the moment when the chains would fail completely. King Alaric sagged against the wall, and I realized the effort of maintaining those barriers was costing him enormously. There's something I haven't told you, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Something the ancient texts revealed only after the curse was already in place. What? The Umbra can be vanquished. Permanently. Destroyed rather than merely contained. He looked at me, and I saw desperate hope warring with centuries of resignation. But it requires the binding ritual to be performed willingly through choice and light, not fear or duty or resignation, but genuine, freely given trust and union. A bond so pure the Umbra cannot corrupt or consume it. My heart hammered. And in 300 years, you've never achieved that? How could I? His laugh was bitter. I brought those women here knowing I was asking them to die. They came willing to sacrifice themselves, yes, but there was always fear. Always grief at what they were losing. The bond was strong enough to contain, never strong enough to destroy. He pushed away from the wall, facing me fully. You're different, Celine. You came here not to die, but to fight. To survive. To protect your sister. That strength, if you could channel it into willing union rather than defiant resistance, might be powerful enough to end this curse forever. You're asking me to trust you. The words came out flat. The monster I came here to destroy. I'm asking you to choose. His voice was raw with something that sounded like hope. Not for me. For the 300 women whose names are carved upstairs. For your sister. For the kingdom that will cease to exist if the Umbra breaks free. He held out his hand, palm up, the mark on his wrist glowing bright. I cannot force this, Celine. It must be your choice, made freely, or it means nothing. Before I could answer, the castle shook. Not like the courtyard's chasm, this was worse. The walls themselves seemed to ripple, reality bending under pressure from something vast and wrong. From the depths below came a sound like triumphant laughter, and I felt the Umbra's presence swell, no longer contained but expanding, reaching, claiming. "It's breaking through," King Alaric said, his face going pale. "We're out of time." The darkness rushed up the stairwell like flood water, swallowing the torchlight, drowning the world in absolute shadow. I felt it touch my skin, cold beyond cold, the sensation of existence being slowly erased. And in that moment of pure terror, I understood what the brides before me had known. Some choices aren't between good and evil. Some choices are between trust and annihilation. I reached for King Alaric's hand in the darkness. "Tell me what to do." King Alaric's hand closed around mine, solid and real in the suffocating darkness. "The ritual chamber," he said, his voice cutting through the Umbra's whispered promises of oblivion. "We have to reach it before the shadow spreads beyond the castle." We ran through corridors that twisted impossibly, the castle itself seeming to resist us as the Umbra's influence warped reality. Paintings on the walls melted into darkness. Stone floors turned to liquid shadow beneath our feet. And everywhere, that terrible voice hissed in languages that predated human thought, promising rest, promising an end to struggle, promising sweet dissolution. Why fight? Why resist? All things end. All light fails. Embrace the mercy of non-existence. Don't listen. King Alaric pulled me forward as the floor behind us simply ceased to be, dropping into a void that had no bottom. "The ritual chamber has protections the Umbra cannot fully corrupt. If we can reach it." The eastern wing appeared ahead, the door to the chamber of carved testimonies still standing despite the chaos consuming the rest of the castle. We burst through, and King Alaric slammed it shut behind us, speaking words of sealing that made the door glow white-hot. It wouldn't hold long. Already, darkness seeped through the cracks like smoke, pooling on the floor and reaching toward us with hungry tendrils. "The altar," King Alaric commanded, pulling me toward the center of the room. "We perform the binding here, now, with whatever time we have left." The altar was the same one where the priestess had performed the first ritual, but now I understood what had been missing. King Alaric placed both his hands on the ancient stone, and the symbols carved into it blazed to life, not silver this time, but gold, bright as sunlight. "This is the true ritual," he said, his voice shaking with exhaustion and desperate hope. "No priestess. No prescribed words. Just choice." He turned to face me, and I saw centuries of loneliness and burden in his eyes. "Celine, I am asking you, not as your king, not as someone who needs your sacrifice, but as someone who has carried this curse alone for 300 years, will you stand with me? Will you trust me enough to forge a bond not of duty or fear, but of freely given choice?" The darkness was rising around us, forming into the Umbra's true shape, massive, writhing, crowned with eyes that reflected only emptiness. It loomed above the altar, larger than the chamber should be able to contain, and its voice was the sound of galaxies collapsing. "Foolish. Pointless. You cannot unmake me. I am entropy itself. I am the end of all things. Your defiance only delays the inevitable." I looked at the shadow creature that had consumed 300 lives. I looked at the walls covered in testimonies of women who'd chosen courage over surrender. And I looked at King Alaric, not the monster from legends, but a man who'd spent centuries protecting a kingdom that hated him, bearing the weight of an impossible burden alone. My choice had brought this catastrophe. My defiance had broken the pattern and unleashed this horror. But maybe my choice could also end it. I placed my hands over King Alaric's on the altar, and the mark on my wrist blazed brilliant white. "I choose this," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my throat. "Not because I have to. Not because I'm afraid. But because I understand now what those women understood, that some things are worth fighting for. Worth trusting for. Worth binding yourself to another person for, even when it's terrifying." King Alaric's eyes widened. "Celine, I choose you," I continued, feeling something shift inside me, the barriers I'd built around my heart since the moment I decided to take Lyra's place, crumbling. I choose to trust that you're not the monster they say you are. I choose to believe that together we're stronger than this curse. I choose this bond freely and completely, with full knowledge of what it means. The moment the words left my lips, light erupted from the altar. Not the cold silver of containment, but warm, blazing gold, the kind of light that comes from genuine connection, from trust forged in the crucible of impossible circumstances, from two people choosing each other when they could have chosen fear. The light poured through our joined hands, through the marks on our wrists, merging and amplifying until it filled the entire chamber. And where it touched the darkness, the Umbra recoiled. No, it shrieked, its voice fracturing into 1,000 discordant notes. This is not possible. This bond, this willing union, it should not exist. It does exist, King Alaric said, his voice resonating with power I'd never heard before. Because she chose it. Truly chose it. Not out of duty or fear or resignation, but out of trust and defiance and her own indomitable will. The light intensified, and I felt our life forces merging, not the surface connection from the first ritual, but something deeper. I could feel his exhaustion, his centuries of loneliness, his desperate hope that maybe, finally, this curse could end. And he could feel my fear, my fierce protectiveness of Lyra, my determination to survive, and my growing understanding that survival didn't mean fighting alone. Together, that merged essence created something the Umbra couldn't consume or corrupt. Pure choice. Pure light. Pure defiance of the void. The Umbra screamed as the light touched its core, and I watched in awe as the ancient curse began to consume itself, darkness devouring darkness, entropy turned inward, the force of dissolution finally meeting something it couldn't unmake. And then, with a final shriek that shook the foundations of the castle, the Umbra collapsed into itself and vanished, leaving only silence and the warm golden light still radiating from the altar. King Alaric and I stood together, hands still joined, breathing hard, surrounded by the testimonies of 300 women who could finally rest. "It's gone," I whispered. "It's really gone." "Yes." He turned to face me, and I saw tears tracking down his face, the first tears I suspected that he'd allowed himself in centuries. "You broke the curse, Celine. Your choice, your genuine, willing choice, created a bond pure enough to destroy what containment could never touch." The castle began to repair itself around us. Cracks sealed. Shadows retreated. Reality solidified into something stable and warm. And when King Alaric asked, "Will you stay?" Not as a bride bound by ritual, but as my partner, my equal, my chosen queen, I found the answer came easily. "Yes," I said, smiling through my own tears. "I choose to stay." Together, we walked out of that chamber into a kingdom finally, permanently free from the shadow that had haunted it for 3 centuries. The sun was rising, the first dawn King Alaric would witness without the weight of the curse on his shoulders. And as we stood on the castle ramparts, watching light reclaim the land, I understood what those 300 brides had always known, that the greatest power isn't in defiance or surrender, but in the choice to trust, to hope, and to believe that even in the darkest night, love and courage can create their own light. The curse was broken. The kingdom was free. And we, 2 people who'd started as enemies, would rule it together, bound not by fate or duty, but by the strongest bond of all, the one we'd chosen for ourselves. What lesson did you learn from Celine about the power of choice, even in the darkest circumstances? Share your answer below. And for more captivating stories, subscribe and turn on notifications for our next exciting tale.